This is Robin on the Road, your concierge for all things travel. And today I'd like to take you on the road with me to Arlington, Virginia, and the Arlington National Cemetery. Pack your bags. Let's go. On a recent on-the-road trip to Arlington, Virginia, I had the pleasure of visiting Arlington National Cemetery. I have been to Arlington many times during my life, and I can tell you it is one of the most beautiful places to visit. Set on the hills above Washington, D.C., the cemetery will affect you, and the memories of this place will stay with you for the rest of your life. For it's in these hallowed grounds that the story of our country and the men and women who fought for it is not only told, but visualized. The Visitor Center and Museum tell the story of Arlington, established by George Washington's adopted grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, as a plantation home called Mount Washington. Upon his death, the plantation will be inherited by his only child, Mary, whose husband is Robert E. Lee. While Lee is associated with the property, he never owns it. Once Lee joins the Confederacy, the family will leave Arlington and will never return to it as their home. The government will seize the property, not out of spite, but due to its strategic location, and 3 forts will be built here during the war. In 1863, a large freedmen's village will form from escaped and freed slaves, covering Section 3, 4, 8, 18, and 20. By May of 1864, the first military burial will be conducted as local cemeteries around Washington, D.C. are filling with the dead. Arlington will officially become a national cemetery in June of 1864. Originally 200 acres, it now contains 639 acres. Segregated until 1948, burial here was not considered an honor, but that of the poor soldier. During the Civil War, high casualty rates and lack of personal identification led to large numbers of unknowns originally being buried along marching routes and battlefields. The system of national cemeteries was established in 1862 to ensure the proper burial of all servicemen. Still, many unknowns remain, and they were recovered for years following the war. In the 1870s, high-ranking Union officers will request burial at Arlington Cemetery, and its stature will grow. 1899, the U.S. government will repatriate soldiers who had been killed in the Spanish-American War. By 1900, Congress will authorize a Confederate Soldiers section to help heal the country. After World War I, 2,000 servicemen will be returned home and buried at Arlington. The tomb of the unknown soldier is dedicated in November of 1921 with the interment of the first unknown, a World War I soldier. Then, in 1930, President William Taft will be buried at Arlington, and in 1963, President John F. Kennedy will be buried here. Requests for burial at Arlington will explode after John F. Kennedy, and the columbarium will be built. Today, 400,000 veterans and eligible dependents are buried here. The nation's history is told in these hallowed grounds. A very thorough search will be conducted before you enter the visitor center. Water may be purchased or brought in, but no food or alcohol is permitted. Open 365 days a year, the hours are seasonal. Maps and brochures, significant history and information can be found at the visitor center. Tickets for the tour bus can also be purchased here. Check the Arlington website and make sure that the days you are visiting that the bus is running. There is a bookstore located at the Visitor Center as well. Bathrooms are here, plus at the Tomb of the Unknown and the Mansion. Plan before you visit Arlington. There are so many graves and a lot of ground to cover. The Arlington website is an excellent resource. Wheelchairs and strollers are not rented at the Visitor Center, but can be accommodated. There is paid parking lot at the cemetery and a metro stop just outside the gates. I was at the cemetery for 6 hours, and it was not possible for me to visit all the graves that I had on my list. As you leave the Museum and Visitor Center, stop to admire the Battle of the Bulge Memorial. Considered the greatest battle of World War II, it will take place in the Ardennes Forest region of Belgium from December 16, 1944 to January 25, 1945. The battle will end the German counteroffensive, but at a great cost, with 75,000 casualties, including 19,000 dead. The memorial was dedicated in May 2006 in a ceremony attended by 300 veterans and their family members. Its main inscription reads, "To the World War II American soldiers who fought in the Battle of the Bulge, the greatest land battle in the history of the United States Army." Text on the base of the memorial reads, "Triumphant courage, and from the grateful people of the Kingdom of Belgium and the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg." The trams were not operating the day of my visit. This can happen several times a year during ceremonies or if there's a large funeral. If you are mobility impaired, please check with the cemetery on the day of your visit and make sure the trams are running. Whether you take the tram or walk the cemetery, I highly recommend you write down the location of the graves that you would like to visit. I walked for 6.5 miles the day I was there. And even though I was not able to see every grave that I had written down, I did come across some that I was not even aware of. As I left the museum, I headed down Eisenhower Drive to the first grave on my list. I'm always struck by the perfection of the Arlington headstones in every direction they line up. This is a newer part of the cemetery. On my way down the road, I passed the McClellan Gate. This was the original entrance to Arlington National Cemetery. Named for Civil War General George B. McClellan, it rises 30 feet above the ground. Atop the arch facing east, inscribed in gold, are lines from Theodore O'Hara's poem, Bivouac of the Dead. On fame's eternal camping ground their silent tents are spread, and glory guards with solemn round the bivouac of the dead. Other lines from the poem are on the west-facing arch. Rest on embalmed and sainted dead, dear as the blood ye gave. No impious footsteps here shall tread on the herbage of your grave. The first grave on my list is that of Colin Luther Powell. This grave was a bit of a challenge for me to find because I was expecting something much larger for this important man, but he chose a soldier's headstone like the men who surround him. General Colin Powell was born in 1937, the son of Jamaican immigrants, and he will grow up in the South Bronx. He was a Vietnam veteran, and I remember him as part of Operation Desert Storm. He will achieve the rank of 4-star general. He was the first African American to hold 3 of the U.S. government's highest positions: the National Security Advisor, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Secretary of State. General Powell will pass in 2021 and is buried in Section 60. General Powell's grave faces the columbarium, interment for cremation burials. Crossing over Bradley Drive, I head to my next stop, the 9/11 Pentagon Group Burial Marker. With the Pentagon in the background, dedicated to the people who were killed in the 9/11 terrorist attack on the Pentagon, plus American Airlines Flight 77, the plane that struck the Pentagon. So many names of people who were living their lives and became innocent victims. On September 12, 2002, a funeral service will be held at the Memorial Amphitheater to honor the 184 victims and recognition for those victims who were not found. The memorial is located in Section 64. From the Pentagon Memorial Marker, I head up Arnold Drive to locate the World War I memorial tree. Hiking uphill, I located 2 markers that were not on my list. The first is the U.S. Coast Guard Memorial, which was dedicated in May 1928. The monument was designed by architect George Howe and sculptor Gaston Lachey. The memorial includes a bronze seagull atop a rock foundation and pyramid design. Above, the Coast Guard motto, Semper Paratus, always ready. The seagull symbolizes the Coast Guard's tireless vigil over the nation's maritime territory. The names of 2 vessels, one Seneca, which on September 16, 1918, volunteered for a rescue party to salvage the British steamer Wellington, which had been torpedoed by a German submarine. 11 of the 19 volunteers will lose their lives when Wellington explodes and sinks. 10 days later, on September 26, an enemy submarine sank the cutter Tampa in the British Channel, killing all 131 on board. The name of other Coast Guard personnel who lost their life during World War I are inscribed here. The monument is located in Section 4. Across from the Coast Guard Memorial in Section 8 is the monument and marker to Robert Edwin Peary and Mathew Henson, the men who discovered the North Pole on April 6, 1909. Peary joined the U.S. Naval Civil Engineer Corps, and after several failed attempts to the North Pole and many lost toes, his 1908 expedition, which will be his last, is when he and Henson discover the pole. His wife Josephine is also buried here. She was an explorer in her own right, and in 1891 will become the first woman to explore the Arctic. Mathew Henson was an African-American born to sharecropper parents in Maryland. He was orphaned at a young age and spent several years at sea as a cabin boy. Peary hires him as an assistant, and between 1891 and 1909 they will conduct 7 Arctic expeditions. Henson's 1912 book, A Negro Explorer at the North Pole, will tell of his experience. Peary receives a Congressional Medal of Honor and promotion to admiral. Henson will not get official recognition until 1944 before he passes in 1955. He is buried in New York's Woodlawn Cemetery. In 1988, he will be reinterred in Arlington next to Peary, a long overdue honor. Across Pershing Drive in Section 34 is the World War I memorial tree, as well as the grave of General John Joseph Pershing, the only person to be promoted in his own lifetime to the highest rank ever held in the U.S. Army, General of the Armies commanding over 2 million soldiers. He graduated from West Point in 1886 and was commissioned as second lieutenant and served in the Indian Wars, the Spanish-American War, and the Philippine-American War. During World War I, Pershing commanded the American Expeditionary Forces in the Meuse-Argonne and other campaigns on the Western Front. Years before his death, he had expressed a wish to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery, and he selected a small hill in the southeastern section of the cemetery for his gravesite. He desired burial with his men instead of officers. From Pershing's grave, I head to the Memorial Amphitheater for one reason. I will return to the amphitheater and the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier for the changing of the guard. The area is the cemetery's central point, and you will not want to miss it on your tour. Across Memorial Drive, the mast of the USS Maine is a powerful experience. On the walk to the memorial, there are several others of note in Section 46. I remember seeing the boy-faced Audie Murphy in The Red Badge of Courage, where he plays a soldier who runs from battle. I had no idea that Murphy did anything but. The son of a sharecropper, he altered his birth certificate to enlist during World War II. At the age of 17, as part of the U.S. Army 3rd Division, Murphy will have his troops fall back during a German panzer attack in France, only to mount a burning tank, call in for an airstrike, and hold off a division alone until that airstrike comes. For his act of tremendous bravery, he is awarded the Medal of Honor. A successful actor, he will die in a plane crash. The U.S. Army 3rd Division Memorial was dedicated on August 15, 1990. The 9-ton gray obelisk lists the battles fought by the division. Formed in 1917, the division will distinguish itself through the Korean War, fighting in 24 campaigns with 52,125 men killed, wounded, or missing. The Canadian Cross originally honored Americans who had fought with the Canadian Army in World War I prior to the entry of America in the war. A bronze sword adorns a 24-foot-high gray granite cross, which is known as the Cross of Sacrifice. Following World War II and the Korean War, additional inscriptions were added to honor Americans who had served with the Canadian Army. On January 28, 1986, the country watched as Space Shuttle Challenger exploded 78 seconds after takeoff, killing the entire crew. The unidentifiable remains of 7 crew members, including those of the first civilian in space, Krista McCullough, are buried here. The grave of Lieutenant Colonel Francis R. Dick Scobie, whose remains were identified, are close by. The tragedy of the Challenger brought the country together as we honored Lieutenant Colonel Francis R. Dick Scobie, U.S. Air Force, Captain Michael J. Smith, United States Navy, Mr. Gregory B. Jarvis, Dr. Ronald E. McNair, Miss Sharon Krista McCullough, Lieutenant Colonel Ellison S. Onakazuka, U.S. Air Force, Dr. Judith Resnick. A poem by John Gillespie Maggle Jr. is on the back. The identified remains of Captain Michael J. Smith are buried in Section 7A. Next to the Challenger Monument is a memorial to the armed service members who lost their life in the attempt to rescue the Iranian hostages on April 25, 1980. On February 1, 2003, the country mourned as Space Shuttle Columbia broke apart during re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. It was the shuttle's 28th mission. Lieutenant Colonel Michael P. Anderson, U.S. Air Force, Captain David M. Brown, U.S. Navy, Captain Laurel Blair Salton Clark, M.D., U.S. Navy, Dr. Kalpana Chawla, Colonel Rick D. Husband, U.S. Air Force, Commander William C. McCool, U.S. Navy, Colonel Ilyan Ramon, Israeli Air Force. The identified remains of Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, Captain David Brown, and Captain Laurel Clark, M.D., have individual graves in Section 46. One of the crews from the U.S. Monitor, who will drown at sea on December 31, 1862, are laid to rest here. 1898, Cuba was fighting Spain for sovereign control. Concerned about American interests, President William McKinley will send the U.S. Maine and a crew of 355 to Havana Harbor. February 15, 1898, the battleship explodes, killing 260 service members. The remains of 230 of these men rest here. While historians argue about the cause of the explosion, the public outcry of "Remember the Maine" and fear of colonization causes the United States to declare war on Spain in April 25th of 1898. The result of this war is a healing from the Civil War, as soldiers who had fought for the Confederacy join the American Army and fight on our side. But Spain will also cede Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Cuba will fall under our protection. Initially, the dead were buried in Havana, but in December of 1899, 165 remains will be reinterred at Arlington. Then, in 1910, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers begin to raise the Maine. 65 additional bodies are recovered. In March of 1912, the mast of the Maine will be placed on a granite turret base. There are 2 bronze mortars captured in Spain, and the ship's bell is placed in the door. The monument was dedicated in May of 1915 by President Woodrow Wilson. It is located in Section 24. I continue down Farragut Avenue to Section 16, known as the Confederate Burial Section. Dominated by the Confederate Memorial, this section sadly has returned to being a contentious one. There are some in the Pentagon who want this memorial removed. After the Spanish-American War had reunited the country, allowing former Confederate soldiers to again participate in the armed forces, Congress will authorize the reinterment of Confederate remains at Arlington, with more than 400 men brought here from around the Washington, D.C. area. The memorial was erected in 1914 and was designed by Confederate veteran and noted sculptor Moses Jacob Ezekiel. The statue stands on a 32-foot-high pedestal with 4 urns representing the 4 years of war. 32 life-size figures depict mythical gods alongside Southern civilians and soldiers. 2 African Americans are depicted in a romanticized take on slavery. At the time the memorial was put up at Arlington, the cemetery was segregated, and the African American soldiers who had fought for the Union were being denied burial here. Relenting, the soldiers were buried in Section 27. Whatever your feelings are about the war, this memorial was placed by a country trying to heal from a devastating civil war, and presidents from Theodore Roosevelt to Barack Obama have laid wreath here on June 7th, the Confederate Memorial Day. Healing must continue, or another war may be fought. From here, I head down McPherson Drive to Section 22 and the memorial to the Rough Riders. Honoring the first volunteer U.S. cavalry, the memorial was dedicated in 1906 to this most famous cavalry unit, known for their charge up San Juan Hill during the bloodiest and most decisive battle of the Spanish-American War. The Battle of the Bulge Memorial was a gift from the people of Belgium for their gratitude to the soldiers of the U.S. Army who fought from December 16, 1944 to January 25, 1945. Arlington has more memorials and grave sites to the Spanish-American War than any other American cemetery. The war was our first major conflict after the Civil War and played a key role in reuniting the country. On May 21, 1902, President Theodore Roosevelt will dedicate a memorial. Standing 50 feet high, it is made from bar granite. The top has a bronze eagle perched on a spear. Black granite spheres stand at each corner of the base, and 44 bronze stars line the border of the upper base. Behind the monument stand 4 Spanish naval guns captured during the war. The 2 inner guns are from the Spanish-American War era, the 2 outer from destroyed Spanish vessels, and they date from 1857 and 1831. This is located in Section 22. Section 21 is sometimes called the Nurses Section. Originally for nurses who had volunteered for the Spanish-American War, there is a memorial for them made of granite and featuring a Maltese cross. This is a resting place for 653 nurses who heroically served the U.S. Armed Forces. Against a backdrop of evergreens, an 11-foot-tall white Tennessee marble statue appears to gaze reverently upon the deceased nurses that lie before her. Representing the spirit of nursing, the figure wears simple attire with her hair pinned up. Sculpted by Francis Rich and unveiled in 1938, the statue initially honored nurses who had died in the service for the Army or Navy. Its meaning has since been expanded to include all nurses who served in the U.S. Armed Forces. An authorization to install a bronze plaque over the existing inscription on the Nurses Memorial reads, "This monument was erected in 1938 and rededicated in 1971 to commemorate devoted service to country and humanity by Army, Navy, and Air Force nurses." Across Memorial Drive in Section 35 is the grave of astronaut John Herschel Glen Jr. Born in 1921, he became a Marine colonel and served in World War II in Korea. A test pilot, Glen is the second American in space and the first to orbit the Earth. Fearing we may lose such an American hero, NASA does not let Glen return to space until 1998 when he is 77 years old, the oldest person put in space at that time. He will serve as U.S. Senator from Ohio, passing in 2016. There are numerous astronauts buried at Arlington Cemetery. The Memorial Amphitheater was dedicated May 15, 1920. 5,000 visitors a year attend 3 major memorial services on Memorial Day, Veterans Day, and Easter. Although President Taft orders it built when Tanner Amphitheater becomes too small to conduct services, President Woodrow Wilson will lay the cornerstone. Designed by Thomas Hastings, the building consists primarily of Vermont Danby marble. Inscriptions above the colonnade list 44 battles fought by the U.S. military from the Revolution to the Spanish-American War. There are also 14 U.S. Army generals and 14 Navy admirals, all from World War I, inscribed on either side of the stage. Inside the apse reads, "When we assume the soldier, we did not lay aside the citizen," from Washington's 1775 letter. The amphitheater is still used for funerals and memorials. Interior space includes a chapel and memorial display room, which now features exhibits on the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier guards. A restroom is located here also. Behind the amphitheater is the tomb or tombs of the unknown soldier. In March 1926, soldiers from a nearby fort were first assigned to guard the tomb of the unknown soldier. Present only during daylight hours, they discouraged visitors from climbing or stepping on the tomb. In 1937, the guards will become a 24/7 presence. Military guard at the tomb changes ceremony every hour on the hour from October 1st through March 31st, and every half an hour April 1st through September 30th. This ceremony is worth your time, and it's the tomb of the unknown that really resonates at Arlington. 24 hours a day, soldiers from the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, known as the Old Guard, stand over the tomb. The tomb guards, also called sentinels, are chosen for this prestigious and highly selective post only after rigorous training and a demanding series of examinations. The Old Guard has held this distinguished duty since 1948.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? I am Sentinel Archer of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, United States Army. Guard of Honor, Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. The ceremony that you are about to witness is the changing of the guard. In keeping with the dignity of this ceremony, it is requested that everyone remain silent and standing.
The tomb guard marches exactly 21 steps down a black mat behind the tomb, turns, faces east for 21 seconds, turns and faces north for 21 seconds, then takes 21 steps down the mat and repeats the process. The number 21 symbolizes the highest military honor that can be bestowed. Think of a 21-gun salute. Next, the sentinel executes a sharp shoulder arms movement to place the weapon on his shoulder closest to the visitors, signifying that he or she stands between the tomb and any possible threat. The sentinels of the tomb of the unknown soldier stand watch 24 hours a day, 365 days a year in any weather. Each soldier must be in superb physical condition and possess an unblemished military record, and stand between 5'8" and 6'4" tall, with weight and build proportional. The tomb guards work on 3 relief rotations. Each relief has 1 commander and about 6 sentinels. The 3 reliefs are organized by height so that those in each guard change ceremony look similar in appearance. The sentinels wear the army dress blue uniform reminiscent of color and style worn by soldiers in the late 1800s. Sentinels are rigorously tested and must memorize over 300 graves and their location at Arlington. Both men and women can serve on this duty. A white marble sarcophagus has stood on a hill overlooking Washington, D.C. since 1921, and it has provided the final resting place for one of America's unidentified World War I service members, and unknowns from later wars were added in 1958 and 1984. One of the consequences of warfare has been large numbers of unidentified dead, from poor record keeping or damage beyond identity, or the need for quick burial. Prior to the Civil War, unknown remains were buried in mass graves. These include unknown soldiers and sailors from the War of 1812 who were discovered buried at the Washington Barracks and reburied at Arlington Cemetery in 1905. At Arlington National Cemetery, there are individual Civil War unknown burials. While exact numbers are unknown, estimates indicate that nearly half of the Civil War dead were unidentified. During the Spanish-American War, identification rates went up significantly as the Army Quartermaster Corps employed burial corps. Dog tags came along during World War I, but so did the question about repatriating or reburial of U.S. soldiers lost overseas. 3,000 from the Spanish-American War was very different from 100,000 casualties future wars would create. In 1920, New York Congressman and World War I veteran Hamilton Fish Jr. proposed legislation that provided for the interment of one unknown American soldier at a special tomb to be built at Arlington Cemetery. The purpose of the legislation was to bring home the body of an unknown American warrior who in himself represents no section, creed, or race in the late war, and who typifies moreover the soul of America and the supreme sacrifice of the heroic dead. In October 1920, 1921, 4 bodies of unidentified U.S. military personnel were exhumed from different American military cemeteries in France. The unknown arrived at the Washington Navy Yard, and in November 1921, they arrived in Washington, D.C., and the unknown lay in state at the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. About 90,000 visitors paid their respects during the public visiting period in November of 1921. The size of World War II made the selection of an unknown much more complicated. The Army will exhume 13 bodies from North Africa and Europe and 5 bodies from the Pacific Front. Additionally, 4 bodies will be exhumed for an unknown from the Korean War, and in May of 1958, all 3 caskets will be placed on the deck of the Canberra, and a Korean War Medal of Honor recipient will choose the World War II unknown. The Korean unknown will be chosen by Army Master Sergeant Ned Lyle. Arlington will begin preparation to add a crypt for the Vietnam unknown, but advances in identification mean that soldiers are easier to identify. By May of 1984, only 1 set of recovered remains had not been identified. On Memorial Day 1984, President Ronald Reagan presides over the internment ceremony in Arlington. These remains will remain unknown for 14 years when DNA confirmed that they were Air Force First Lieutenant Michael Joseph Blasey. There is no loud talking, smoking, gum chewing, or any other disrespectful behavior allowed at the tomb of the unknown soldier. The sentinels will stop and they will yell at you. Leaving the amphitheater, I noticed a large flagstaff and I walked over to discover who it was. The Woodall Memorial Flagstaff is 90 feet tall and one of only 2 flagpoles at Arlington. The flagstaff commemorates Commander Maxwell Woodall, who served in the U.S. Navy from 1832 until his death in 1863 when he was accidentally killed during a ceremonial gunfire salute in Baltimore. His son Maxwell Van Sant Woodall was a Union Army officer who rose to the rank of Brevet General. Their names and service are inscribed at the base. As I walk around the amphitheater to the Korean War Memorial Contemplative Bench, I pass so many memorial trees and plaques. These are located all over the cemetery and line the sections of plots. So much honor, loss, and valor. The Korean War Memorial Contemplative Bench was dedicated on July 27, 1987, in a ceremony attended by the Korean War veterans and the South Korea's ambassador. It is surrounded by trees donated by South Korea. It honors the 54,246 dead, 8,177 missing, and 389 unaccounted for POWs. Below the tomb of the unknown soldier are some of the best views of the cemetery and DC beyond. Section 7 is located here, and on my way to see the grave of 5-star General George Marshall, I realize I'm in a multi-star officer section. Born in 1880, he was a graduate of VMI and served on General Pershing's staff during World War I. He will serve as Chief of Staff of the Army during World War II and will increase the size of the Army and our arsenal. Promoted to 5-star in 1944, he will help shape American military strategy. Post-war, under Truman, he serves as Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, the only person to hold both offices. He will win a Nobel Prize in 1953 for his program of rebuilding Western Europe, which will become known as the Marshall Plan. Walking through Section 7, I cross over one of the original waterways that belonged to the plantation and cross into Section 2 and up Chaplains Hill. Military chaplains from over 4 wars rest here, including the 1st Army chaplains from World War I and II. Vietnam chaplain Major Charles Joseph Waters received the Medal of Honor posthumously for his bravery trying to render aid to his fallen comrades. The second monument to the 134 Protestant chaplains who lost their lives in World War I and II was dedicated in 1981. The third monument is to 83 Catholic chaplains who died in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, and was dedicated in 1989. The most recent monument is for 14 Jewish chaplains who died in active duty in the armed forces and was dedicated in 2011. Section 2 partially surrounds Arlington House and is in the older part of the cemetery and contains many Civil War graves. Section 1, 2, and 3 became popular burial locations for Civil War officers. My endpoint was the monument to Pan Am Flight 103 that was blown up over Lockerbie, Scotland, when I came across the impressive grave of Major General Phillip Kearny. Known as an excellent writer, the monument was intended to be a gift from the state of New Jersey. It depicts Kearny without his left arm from a wound he received in the Mexican War. This did not keep him out of the Civil War, and he was killed at the Battle of Chantilly outside D.C. in 1862. As the monument went up, veterans from his former brigade petitioned the family for Kearny to be moved, and he will be reinterred here in 1914 with President Taft presiding over his funeral. Across from Kearny's grave is the James Tanner Amphitheater. Built in 1873, it was named after Corporal James Tanner, who received a terrible wound and post became a stenographer. He was called to the bed of a dying President Lincoln to take dictation. The amphitheater will be used for ceremony and services until the larger Memorial Amphitheater is built. Abner Doubleday was a career Army officer who fought in several major battles during the Civil War, but it was as a supposed inventor of baseball that he became known. This has since been debunked by historians, but the myth lives on. On December 21, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 was blown up by a terrorist bomb over Lockerbie, Scotland. 11 of the 270 souls lost were on the ground. The cairn is a memorial and gift from the people of Scotland, raised by private funds. It contains 270 sandstone blocks from a quarry 8 miles from the disaster. The monument is located in Section 1. A few feet away from Arlington House is the monument to the Civil War soldiers who died on the battlefields around D.C. and were reinterred here in what would have been Mrs. Lee's Rose Garden. General Montgomery Meigs considered Lee a traitor and proposed Arlington as a cemetery. In 1865, a 20-foot pit was dug for 2,111 unknown soldiers to be buried, the first monument to the unknown at Arlington. Today it's hard to imagine the carnage we perpetrated on one another. I will cover Arlington Mansion and the interior in another video, so stay tuned. The view from the front of the house is absolutely incredible. The plantation stretched all the way to the Lincoln Memorial. Today, the Memorial Bridge spans the Potomac and was dedicated in 1932 and is meant to be a symbolic link between North and South. There are many memorials and monuments along its span. It's fitting that looking out on this grand view that the grave of Captain Charles Pierre L'Enfant. Born in France, he will come to the U.S. and fight in the Revolutionary War and serve on Washington's staff. Post-war, he was architect and planner of Washington, D.C. He will die in poverty at a farm in Maryland and be buried there. In 1909, Congress orders his body reinterred at Arlington after laying in state at the Capitol, and he gets the grandest view of all. His grave is located in Section 3. Next to the grave of L'Enfant is that of General Philip Sheridan, one of 3 men credited with winning the Civil War along with Grant and Sherman. When war breaks out, the industrialized Northern soldiers just don't have the time in the saddle that their Southern counterparts do, and the Union cavalry suffers greatly. Sheridan, standing a little over 5 feet tall, changes this. Arlington was a cemetery for the poor soldier, but Sheridan's burial in 1899 will change the stature of Arlington, and Union officers will begin to request burial here. On the way down the old stairs to John F. Kennedy's grave, I come across the grave of Mary Randolph, the first known person to be buried at Arlington. She was a direct descendant of Pocahontas and cousin to Thomas Jefferson.
Truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. Finally, whether you are citizens of America or citizens of the world, ask of us here the same high standard of strength and sacrifice which we ask of you. With a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking His blessing and His help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own.
John Fitzgerald Kennedy was 46 years old. Robert Francis Kennedy's grave is a short walk from John's. Robert was a World War II Navy veteran, Attorney General, and Senator. In 1968, he was a presidential contender when he was assassinated in Los Angeles on June 5th. Thousands will line the route from New York to Washington. In 1971, a more elaborate gravesite retained the simple white cross and added a granite plaza. Like John F. Kennedy's grave, there are quotes from two of his most famous speeches. It is from numberless diverse acts of courage and belief that human history is shaped. Each time a man stands up for the ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy, and daring those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest wall of oppression and resistance. Some men see things that are and ask why. I dream of things that never were and ask why not. Robert Francis Kennedy was 45 years old. Senator Edward Moore Kennedy passed on August 25, 2009, and was laid to rest a few steps from his older brothers John and Robert. While he was not as glamorous and beloved as his older brothers, he will have a longer career, serving 47 years in Washington politics. Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. was the eldest of 9 children and older brother to John, Robert, and Ted. He was a World War II U.S. Navy pilot who was killed on a secret bombing mission over the English Channel on August 12, 1944. His remains were never recovered. He was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, a Distinguished Flying Cross, an Air Medal, and a Purple Heart. All 4 memorial graves are located below Arlington House. Thurgood Marshall was the first African-American Supreme Court justice, serving for 24 years. He helped found the NAACP and had won 29 of 32 cases he had argued before the court prior to his appointment, including Brown versus the Board of Education, which will end school segregation. He is buried in Section 5. Numerous Supreme Court justices are buried here, including, most recently, Ruth Bader Ginsberg. The first Jewish appointee and second woman to serve on the Supreme Court, she served from 1993 until her death in September of 2020. Described by Chief Justice John Roberts as a tireless and resolute champion of justice, the notorious RBG, as her supporters affectionately dubbed her, eventually became a feminist icon who inspired multiple generations of Americans. Robert Todd Lincoln was the son of Mary Todd and Abraham Lincoln, and the only one of their children to live into adulthood. He will serve as assistant to U.S. Grant during the Civil War and is present when his famous father dies. A Harvard-educated lawyer, he serves as Secretary of War and U.S. Ambassador to the U.K. Famous in his own time, he chooses burial at Arlington instead of the family crypt in Springfield, Illinois. He is located in Section 31. President William Howard Taft was the 27th President of the United States and the only one to become Supreme Court Justice after his presidency. He is the first of 2 presidents to be buried at Arlington after his death on March 8, 1930. His headstone was designed by James Earl Fraser, who was also the designer of Robert Todd Lincoln's grave. It stands 14 feet high and is made of dark mahogany granite. He is buried in Section 30. The last grave I was able to visit on my list was that of 5-star General Omar Bradley. My reason is twofold. Bradley was the last of the 5-star generals from World War II to pass, and when I first came to his grave, he was alive. And it's for this reason that I am back. Arlington Cemetery is a place that will stay with you for the rest of your life. I can think of no other place where our military story exists and has existed for so long. When I think of the nation's cemetery, I think of Arlington. I cannot recommend it highly enough as a trip to this beautiful and moving place of honor. Things to know before you go. Arlington National Cemetery is open daily from 8 to 5. Water may be brought in or purchased, but no other food or beverages are allowed. A thorough bag check and 100% ID check is conducted at the Visitor Center. Parking is $3 an hour with a max of $12. No pets except for those with disabilities are allowed. Tram tours depart every 20 minutes from 8:30 to 4:30. The tour is a live narrated loop and an on-again, off-again tour that makes 4 stops. Tickets can be purchased at the Visitor Center or online. Check with the cemetery as trams do not run on special occasion. Adults are $19.50, children are $10.75, and seniors $15, with special prices for military and veterans. The changing of the guard ceremony at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is conducted every hour on the hour in winter and every half an hour during the summer months. Wheelchairs and strollers are not provided at the visitor centers but may be brought in. The ground is undulating and there are lots of ankle twisting holes throughout, so watch your step. There are several honored days. Flags and wreaths are placed on all graves during military holidays and Christmas. The Arlington National Cemetery webpage and app are an excellent source for information. There are so many graves to see, and even though I had a plan, I ran out of steam before I was able to see all the graves on my list. Take time to plan and then expect surprises. You will not be able to see all the graves in one day. For this on-the-road trip, I chose to stay at the Hyatt Regency Crystal City. It was actually less expensive than some other choices, including an Airbnb. Be aware that nothing is included with your room. That means meals or parking. There are free trams to the metro, or you can walk to one in about 10 minutes. The metro is the best way I have found to get around, and there is a station right outside Arlington Cemetery. I will provide details in my description. Lastly, I would like to thank you, fellow traveler, for taking a long look at Arlington National Cemetery with me. Please smack that bell and subscribe, and smash that like button so you don't miss any future road trips. And check out my latest video on the Blue Ridge Tunnel. This is Robin on the Road, your concierge for all things travel, and I hope to see you out there on a road of your own. Until then, safe travels.